안녕하십니까. 제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 지금부터 기후변화와 지속가능한 평화 시사점 및 향후 계획 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 본 행사는 동시통역이 제공되며 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여 있는 수신기를 착용하시기 바랍니다. 한국어 채널은 1번, 영어는 2번입니다. 감사합니다. 세션의 진행을 맡아주실 좌장님을 소개해 드리겠습니다. 좌장님은 유엔훈련연구기구 제주국제연수센터 최홍기 소장님입니다. 소장님께서는 2020년까지 외교부와 미국, 에티오피아, 오스트리아, 요르단, 터키 등의 다양한 국가에서 근무하며 주 유엔 참사관, 국방부, 국제정책관, 국제안보대사 등을 역임하였고 현재는 유엔국제연구기구의 지역연수센터인 제주국제연수센터의 소장으로 계십니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum. Thank you for joining us today for climate change and sustainable peace, implications and ways forward. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 1. For English, select channel 2. Now, I would like to hand over the stage to the director Choi Hong-gi, who will moderate this session. Everyone, please welcome the moderator.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to you all. As introduced, I'm Hong-gi Choi, Director of UNITAR CIFAL Jeju, Jeju International Training Center. It is a great pleasure to moderate the session on such an important issue, climate change and sustainable peace. Given that we suffer climate disasters, including heat waves and severe floods resulting from climate change at the moment. Having said that, let me briefly introduce what this session is about. The threat posed by climate change have been recognized as one of the key issues that needs to be discussed and addressed. We frequently see more disasters take place. For instance, intense floods and droughts, storms, lack of drinking water and food, and rising sea levels caused by climate change. These climate disasters undermine people's security and well-being, while those suffering from lack of water or food caused by climate change can often get involved in conflicts over the allocations of the resources. This can have a devastating influence on both human and national security in political, societal, and economic aspects. Against this backdrop, the session has been organized to explore the climate and security nexus and to discuss how to interpret the nexus for building sustainable peace together with the ways forward. Hopefully, insightful thoughts on climate and conflicts nexus, as well as approaches to building sustainable peace, will be shared and discussed. Before I give the floor to our panelists, let me briefly describe how the session will be run. We are given 80 minutes for the whole session, and we have 4 panelists invited to the session with 2 panelists, 2 presenters online, and 2 discussants on site. First, there will be 2 presentations by 2 virtual speakers with 15 minutes max each, followed by the discussion, where 2 discussants will make some comments or raise some questions on what has been presented by the presenters for maximum 10 minutes respectively. This will lead to 1 round of discussion among panelists, and we can go further for another round of discussion when time permits. Next, I'll open the floor to the audience for additional comments and questions. And I will wrap up the session with some final remarks from the invited panelists. Last but not least, as we have only limited time, I want your talking points to be concise and kindly ask you to make your best to complete the presentation and comments within the given time. Now, let me introduce our distinguished speakers in brief, one by one. The first presenter is Dr. Soo-young Hwang, who is a legal officer with the UN Environment Program, where she works on the advancement and implementation of environmental rule of law and environmental rights. Before joining UNEP, she worked with the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, taking care of economic, social, and environmental issues. Dr. Florian Klemp is our second presenter. He is the Director of Climate Change and Risk Program in Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, CIFAL. His work connects academia and policy and focuses on the foundations of peace and security, especially the processes of building peace after armed conflict in regions highly exposed to climate change. We also have two discussants here on site. One of them is Dr. Kyungyeon Moon, Assistant Professor of School of International Studies at Jeonbuk National University. Prior to joining Jeonbuk National University, he was a research fellow at different institutes, including the Research Institute for North Korea Development. His research interests include Korea's international cooperation policy, aid architecture, and assistance to North Korea. Mr. Tak-gun Lee is the other discussant, who is an associate legal officer working at UNHCR Korea. Before joining the UNHCR, he worked as public interest lawyer, focusing on rights of refugees and migrants. He also serves as secretary in the Refugees and Migrants Special Committee of the Korean Bar Association. Without further ado, let me invite Dr. Hwang to the floor for the first presentation. She will talk about interlinkages between climate, human rights, and conflict. Dr. Hwang, the floor is yours.
네, 안녕하십니까. 저는
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Soo-young Hwang. I'm working at UNEP. Thank you very much for inviting me today. Currently, I'm in Nairobi, connecting and joining this forum. I'm so sorry for not being able to be with you in Jeju. Today, I'm going to talk about environment, in particular climate change, human rights, and conflict, and how they are related to one another. First of all, I'm going to touch upon the relationship between human rights and climate change, followed by climate change and conflict, and also I will cover legal and policy frameworks in the UN, and I'm going to talk about what the UN is doing. First, I believe you are not familiar with this theme, human rights and climate change, how they are linked. Indeed, there are many types of human rights, but we need to ask what kind of human rights are relevant to climate change. But rather than doing that, we need to think about what human rights are not relevant to climate change. There are many types of human rights, and it's hard to find the one that is not linked to climate change. For example, right to life, right to participation, right to food, right to housing. All these rights are linked to climate change and affected by climate change. So the environment, climate change, and human rights, they are very much closely related to one another. individual relationships. And regardless of rights that are related to climate change, we need to think about who is affected by climate change. But we are all affected by climate change, whether you are poor or rich, whether it be developing states or developed states. All people are being affected, and among them, the most vulnerable people will be covered later on, but those living in conflict areas are the hit hardest. Those people do not have enough infrastructure, and because of climate change, they are not well capable of being adapting to climate change. So that's why the vulnerable people, in particular people living in conflict areas, are the most vulnerable. In particular, aborigines or women, people with disabilities, and islanders in a small island states. They are affected more than us by climate change. Then why are we talking about human rights when it comes to climate change? You may say we can just stop the climate change, but indeed, when it comes to practice, rather than talking about only reducing climate change, mitigating climate change, we need to show, indeed, showing people some islanders thinking is a bit kind of violating of human rights. And so many people's human rights are violated because of climate change. Indeed, human rights can be very helpful for all of us in addressing climate change. Indeed, it is the matter of human rights, as well as because of and through human rights, people can claim that their rights are violated and they can use some tools. So that's why it is very helpful to talk about human rights when it comes to dealing with climate change. Then let's see the relationship between conflict and climate change. Of course, they are affecting one another. Climate change is contributing to conflict, for example, food insecurity, or water scarcity, or resource competition. Inter-countries, or between villages, between countries, inside the countries, there will be water scarcity. So because of water scarcity caused by climate change, will lead to conflict, whether it's small or large. And climate-induced migration is happening. Because of climate change, people cannot live in where they live in. So that's why they migrate into other areas. And conflicts are also affecting climate change. Then how? Illegal logging can have a huge impact on climate change because of illegal logging and other activities. In particular, in conflict areas, illegal logging is on the rise, which caused a lot of troubles in climate change. So they are affecting each other. So climate change is related to human rights, and conflict is related to human rights, and peace and security are closely linked to climate change as well. And also human rights are under influence of climate change. So peace and security, development, human rights are stipulated in the UN Charter, but indeed, environmental issues including climate change are included. So all issues are interconnected. Then let's look at the UN and the international framework, including legal and policy frameworks. First, the most important thing and is the Paris Agreement, which is the outstanding one. So for the first time in the world, the Paris Agreement is talking about human rights as a environmental treaty. So if you look at them, Of course, countries are obliged to address human rights issues and respect human rights. This is what the Paris Agreement covers. And also in other environmental treaties cover human rights issues. And human rights councils or UN General Assembly's resolutions cover conflict, human rights, and climate change and the environment.
그리고 유엔에서 봤을 때 또 어떠한
And from the perspective of the UN,
어떠한 동향들이 있냐면
there are some trends in human rights.
퓨리티 바디라는 게 있거든요.
There are treaty bodies under UN human rights mechanism. There are many human rights laws. One of them is civil political rights.
담당하고 있는 커미티가 휴먼 라이츠 커미티라고 합니다.
And there is a committee in charge of it. So right to life is one of the topics. And it covers also civil relations as well. And a few years ago, it made an announcement called General Comment. Right to life was also a topic in the past for discussion. The government not violating the right to life is protecting human rights. But because of climate change, inaction to climate change is the government violating people's right to life. This is how we understand today. So climate change is closely related to right to life. So the government should take active actions, and Human Rights Committee is having commissions. And going forward, climate change related petitions are being created. So through UN human rights mechanisms, people can know their rights are being violated and what kind of rights are violated by climate change. So petitions have been made a lot. And one is the conventional rights on the child. The international community, almost all countries in the world are members of that treaty. And that is monitored by the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And there are many petitions as well. And as you know, Greta Thunberg and 15 children, we call those who under 18 children. So 15 children announced that because of climate change, their rights are being violated, and not just our rights, but when it comes to future generations, their rights might be compromised as well. That's what their concerns were. So that's why 15 children made petitions. So because of climate change, so many petitions have been submitted to UN human rights mechanisms, and at the same time, right to life, right to environment, and right environmental justice, and not just current generations' rights, but also future generations' rights are being talked a lot. So this is the global trend. And there is another human right mechanism. It is called special procedures. It is released by Human Rights Council. So this mechanism covers climate change, human rights, and environmental justice, as well as conflicts and disputes. So as you can see on the top side, on the top left side, you can see an island called Marshall Island. It is a small island state. And in the country, our representatives of the Korean government so the representatives making presentations. So small island states are facing a lot of challenges, dire challenges, including rising sea levels. Because of rising sea levels, their human rights are being affected. In particular, aborigines living there are living in near shores, but they need to migrate because of climate change. And next, conflicts, as I mentioned before,
대리 부족, 노인 포수력 한산이라는
can be caused by food insecurity and the scarcity of water. So conflict between villages and conflict between people could be caused, and also conflicts between small island states could happen. And the other picture is taken in Fiji. I was a part of a mission. The village, because of rising sea levels, the village migrated several times, but they couldn't do it more. So that's why they moved far away from where they lived. So indeed, relocating itself is very challenging and demanding, but for 100 years, that village in Fiji have moved because of rising sea levels. Indeed, right to housing has been improved, and most of people in the village were fishers, and they will get very distant from where they work. And also, their right to daily lives have been violated a lot because regarding ancestors. Island states are good. Some island states had a good experience of solving issues between countries. So, in a few decades, if a country might disappear, then for migration, some island states are having negotiations. So, because of climate change, they can prevent conflict and prevent violation of human rights. And I saw some countries, island countries, resolving their issues and debates. And as I mentioned, I'm working at the UNEP. We are in charge of many environmental matters. We are covering conflict, peace and security, climate change, and human rights. They are interlinked. So that's why the UNEP is actively working on human rights issues. And also, UN Human Rights Council, we are also doing our parts and roles. So everything is being integrated because with just one theme, we cannot deal with climate change. And we cannot see human rights issues just as human rights issues. So that's why everything is being integrated today. And last but not least, what I want to say is
마지막으로 이제 인권이라든지 기후변화라든지 그리고
human rights, climate change, conflict, disputes. So there have been some breaking throughs from the UN. So right to environment was acknowledged as human right for the first time in the world through the resolution by the Human Rights Councils. So because of that resolution, the right to environment was acknowledged as right to life. And this July, UN General Assembly was held. Indeed, it is higher than Human Rights Council. So the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution saying environmental is a new human right. So that was a quite breakthrough when a new human right was created. And we need to think about those new resolutions, whether those resolutions can cover and deal with climate change issues, human rights issues, and whether they can prevent conflicts. I believe those resolutions would be very helpful in solving issues and preventing conflict. So with this, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Hong. As indicated in her presentation, it is important that the global community needs to put more focus on the impacts of climate change, in particular on human rights. It is true that two different areas, climate change and human rights, are interlinked. And more often, we see negative consequences resulting from the interlinkage. Climate change is indeed influencing the landscape of human security, let alone the requirement for building peace. I believe Dr. Cramp will help us gain further insight into this interlinkage issue and the impact of climate change on peace and security. Let me invite our second speaker, Dr. Florian Cramp. He will help us rethink the climate conflict nexus for promoting sustainable peace. Dr. Cramp, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good morning from Stockholm. It's a distinct pleasure to join you here. I would also love to be with you in person, but it's still a distinct pleasure to be here. And thank you for the invitation and the task to rethink the climate conflict nexus for promoting sustainable peace, which I think is an absolutely important and critical question. And I think several of parts of my remarks will connect to the previous speaker very closely. In May 2020, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute launched a report called The Environment of Peace, an effort by over 2 years by over 30 researchers that were involved in the course of this. And the report, unfortunately, shows us without little doubt that security and climate change are interlinked. It shows us that the world today is facing an intertwined security crisis and an environmental crisis. Both of these crises interact and are enhancing each other. And we see that not because we wanted to connect environment and security issues in this report, but we see that the world is like that. These issues are inextricably linked, if we want it or not. And wars that we see today, like in Ukraine, I think it shows it very clearly, especially once we zoom out. We know, we know that you damage the environment, you damage peace. You damage peace, you damage the environment. This relationship is very clear in the research world and gives us a challenging task. It gives us a challenging task because the interaction of climate change and conflict and of these intertwining security crises are changing the global security landscape. And by extension, they are changing what it means to build peace. The connections between climate change and conflict were mentioned before. I think it is very important that we increasingly study these and acknowledge these connections. We see very clearly that climate change is having impact on people's vulnerability, which translates through various ways into insecurity. All of that is happening in a human security space, first and foremost. But we see increasingly that we have spillover effects, how this is translating also into hard security challenges, not least in the context of peace building. As climate change and peace building are linked, and we see that we know that climate change is changing what it means to build peace, let me share some remarks from or reflections from our work on studying this specifically. A lot of the work in this context has previously focused on understanding the causality, understanding the relationship. But in 2019, we started work where we very explicitly wanted to look at the connection to peace building itself. What we see, status December 2020, that 6 of the 10 largest UN peace-building operations, both special political missions and peacekeeping operations, are located in areas highly exposed to climate change. And to show that even more extreme part, it is 80% of all UN personnel deployed in these contexts that is in areas highly exposed to climate change. It is a tremendous challenge. We need to acknowledge that these crises and that are intertwining and are a serious problem. In this research that we undertook, first looking at Somalia and later at Mali, we wanted to explicitly study how climate change is impacting the mandate of peace-building operations. And while I was relatively certain that we would find impacts, I was stunned that we found impacts across the mandate of peace-building operations. So let me dive a little bit into the context of Somalia here. If we divide the mandate of the operation in Somalia into three categories, we see one cluster that deals with peace and security challenges very explicitly. We see one that deals with state building and governance explicitly. And we see one that deals with human rights and humanitarian issues. Starting with the first, the implications of climate change playing out in Somalia have severe implications on the peace and security elements of the mandate. A large part of this is, for instance, disarmament and demobilization of armed groups. In fact, what we see is that because of the impacts and pressures that climate change has on the population, it creates opportunities, recruitment opportunities for non-state armed actors to recruit for their strife. We see actors like Al-Shabaab that can capitalize on the poor living conditions and economic opportunities that exist and recruit among populations that were displaced because of the conflict, but also to a large extent because of the impacts of climate change, be it drought or flooding. Especially in urban areas where these populations have moved in the course of time, we see that these recruitment efforts are happening, especially in informal settlements, and the opportunity to earn €500 for joining Al-Shabaab and being active in this is a hard challenge. The second part, how it is undermining the peace and security side, is that it directly impacts the operational ability of the peacebuilding or peacekeeping troops. We see that peacekeepers, both in Somalia, but also especially in Mali, have a hard time in operating in this environment. During floods, it is very difficult to reach the population and offer protection of civilian services. It is very easy, on the other hand, for insurgent groups and non-state armed actors to operate in this environment who are more dependent on a small motorbike or a small boat and can navigate this environment much clearer. It also impacts the security of these troops in itself as because of increased sandstorms. For instance, in Mali, we see that missions and peacekeeping troops are confined to their compounds and have actual issues in surveilling the security parameter for their own compound. So these are the peace and security elements. Just to add to the recruitment side, which I think is a really interesting finding from research here, is that yes, we see the impact on recruitment because of economic incentives, but climate change and the impact it has on people's livelihood and taking away people's livelihood is also creating an identity void. People that were farmers all their lives or herders are impacted by climate change, are losing their livelihoods. And armed actors have an ability to fill this identity void by giving a new character, a new social belonging element to these people. The second element is state building and governance. And I think here are some really interesting but also problematic questions that really demand us to rethink our way of working. One is the impact that climate change has indirectly on the legitimacy of the state building process. What do I mean with that? We see that actors like Al-Shabaab are actively taxing humanitarian aid. And we see that for good reasons, otherwise we wouldn't be able to deliver humanitarian aid in this context. So humanitarian actors are paying Al-Shabaab for access to get access to the population. What that at the same time creates is not only a funding structure for an insurgent actor, but it actively undermines a state-building process as Al-Shabaab is able to present itself as a legitimate de facto state actor that has full authority over certain parts of the land, with detrimental impacts on the legitimacy of the national government or federal government. The second part, and I don't think we have an answer to this, but it is absolutely a problem. We see an impact of undermining peace agreements, especially in the sense of governance peace agreements. The city of Baidoa experienced that very vividly, where because of the influx of displaced people, because of conflict and climate change, the ethnic composition of the city has drastically changed. Well, before that, the UN had implemented a power sharing agreement, which was along ethnic lines. Well, now these ethnic lines, the proportionality is not a given anymore, and we see a power sharing agreement that is obsolete, which raises for us the important question: how do we make our peace agreements that should give some certainty and stability? How do we arrange these peace agreements in a context that is increasingly uncertain and has to account for this uncertainty and change in the process? The third element is the impact on human rights and humanitarian issues, and I think Su Young-Wang already mentioned quite a few of those, so I won't spend too much time on that. But I think here specifically important the impact on sexual and gender-based violence in this context, where we on the one hand see women specifically exposed to increasingly harsh and insecure conditions because of migration patterns, which are typically men leaving the towns and villages, leaving women and children behind, exposing women to more insecurity, with the impact on water security, with women having to travel longer distances to gather water, etc. But also herders, mainly men in this context, are also exposed to sexual and gender-based violence, increasingly who, because of the impacts of climate change, have to travel further distances and are thus exposed. An important asterisk, I guess, in this element would be that because of these impacts, we also see actual opportunities. Changed gender roles because women there's interesting research by UNEP where we see a feminization of villages in a lot of these contexts where new roles and new opportunities arise, and I think that is something we should study more to consider how women's agency in this context in impacting structural change of society. So let me close. We see the impact that climate change has on peace building, both in the peace and security side, in the governance and state building side, as well as in the human rights and humanitarian side. So what do we need to do? I believe we need first to recognize that climate change and security are interlinked. We need to tackle both crises at the same time. It is not a technical solution that will suffice. It is both a technical solution and a political solution that needs to come together. We need to prepare our institutions to respond. I think we see beginnings of that, an increased recognition of climate security within a lot of institutions, and a sustained effort, for instance, within the UN system through the climate security mechanism, bringing together important actors across different silos, from UNDP through UN Environment and the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. But to be successful in that, we need to start to think different, and we need to start thinking different in these institutions. And the beginning of that must be to think about building peace. I mentioned at the beginning, environment and security are interlinked, but actually the environment and peace are interlinked as well. The reverse is true. If we protect the environment, we protect peace, and if we protect peace, we protect the environment. That means peace building is development, and it is climate action in the ideal place. And we need to come and rethink our efforts of building peace with such a lens that looks at the synergies and opportunities that arise. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kramp, for sharing with us your insight on the climate conflict nexus, along with the CIFAL's long-term research work on climate change and conflict, and some key takeaways. A better understanding of how to operationally and programmatically integrate ecological environment consideration into peace building. I would like to hear more about the nexus and how to interpret it in finding an opportunity to refresh and scale up global effort to address climate security through the discussion with the other panelists. Having said that, I would like to invite two discussants to make a quick comment and questions. Dr. Moon, could you please first share your thoughts on the presentation, on the presented issues?
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed two presentations by Dr. Huang and Mr. Floyens about the kinds of relationship between environment, human rights, and peace. I'm very happy to share my general view on those two topics. There has been a long discussion about climate change and its impact on human rights, and peace, etc. However, as humans have recently begun to feel the effect of climate change, they have only begun to take actions. It is no exaggeration to say that whether such difficult extended Paris Agreement will be implemented nationwide is a still matter of different dimensions. And moreover, the traditional conflict like Russia's invasion to Ukraine still act as a threat to peace and human rights in our daily lives. This is because it is causing many European countries to return to coal power again, and again, to reverse our effort on climate changes as of now. Even if it is not Russia's war in Ukraine, the international cooperation policy of traditional donor countries such as United Kingdom, the US, Australia, and Canada have recently been reorganized around their national interests. Reshoring is not only occurring in economy, but also in foreign aid and international cooperation policies, which are means of solving common problems in global communities. The reshoring to national interests is observed in foreign aid and international cooperation too. It is in this phenomenon, it cannot be ignored that the distribution of public goods, we also describe we call it official development assistance, like foreign aid, is a strengthening from national interest perspective rather than a response to global public goods. The theme of this session is climate change, human rights, and peace. In international development corporations, the international organizations and development banks like World Bank are taking an integrated approach rather than a separate approach under the name of humanitarian development and peace nexus, so-called, we call the HDP nexus. In fact, it will take a long time for those international initiatives to be internalized into the individual cooperation policies of individual donor countries. South Korea is carrying out very rudimentary HDP nexus approach in Vietnam, Cambodia, to remove anti-personnel mines for peace building activities, support landmine damaged and disabled people through the humanitarian activities and humanitarian operations, and implement the profit generating agricultural development policies project for landmine removal areas. As such, international community have advocated HDP nexus, but in fact, there are not many meaningful projects. Even if you look at many projects such as UNDP and FAO project, there are not many cases and programs and projects where HDP nexus approach is combined or internalized. In other words, climate change, peace, and human rights nexus projects are needed, but the real world we live in is showing a different appearance. It can be said that it is very urgent to find aid projects through a climate change adoptions and mitigation perspective in the field of development corporations, such as expansion of awareness that the climate change has a very worrisome impact on peace and human rights. But the reality is not. The recent national the flooding in Pakistan is a typical of damage caused by climate change, which is a phenomenon in which the drought and accumulated water vapors in some parts of the world spray heavy rain on the other side of the world. It is already evaluated that the phenomenon predicted by the very scientists began many years ago, but we couldn't help but ask ourselves what preparations we have made. A paradigm shift that changed the direction of international cooperation to climate change, peace, and human rights is urgently, boldly, and irreversibly needed. But it is not known who, when, and how to read this transition. Also, as one of discussion today, the subject and direction of these changes are invisible. I'd like to make some questions to Dr. Huang and Mr. Florian through your presentations, different from already you sent to the organizing committees. Some of my questions you already respond through your presentations, but my fundamental question is, it is to Dr. Huang, it is no exaggeration to say that the Ukraine war has created another obstacle to the implementation of NDC, nationally determined contribution for carbons, as European countries have increased their financial burdens, such as increasing coal power generations and increasing people's energy subsidies. How can we and UNEP break through the current situations? That is my simple questions. And I also would like to ask about the position of UNEP in global architecture. Like the environmental issue is kinds of cross-cutting issues, right, affecting many issues, not just human rights, peace, development cooperation, eradication of poverty. I'm just wondering the position of UNEP over or throughout other United Nations organizations. That is my questions. To Florian is I heard the presentation of the analysis based on the field and example of the impact of climate change on peace and security. In Korea, I hope that the non-traditional security threat research institute like the CIFAL will be established in national level or private institutions or universities. As far as I know, the UN agency has drawn a world map of drought-prone areas due to climate changes. And so in the beginning of your presentation, you show us your paper report, Environment of Peace, kinds of things. According to that map, there was a scientific analysis that Pakistan, which suffered from the national flood, was a flood area, right? Based on these maps, I think we can draw a future dispute map. If so, it is possible to establish a strategy to prevent dispute, but there are study on preparing a dispute map based on climate change predictions. My question in short is that what kinds of seriousness or rigorous analysis between climate change and conflict in your paper? That is my questions. And which country, more detail, which country is the most risky country or region, according to your analysis? That is my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moon, for sharing some critical points for further discussion on climate change, peace, and human rights. It is obvious that we need to be well aware of serious concerns that the impact of climate change on peace and human rights are significant, and I agree with the need for paradigm shift to address the challenges caused by climate risk. I'm sure that we can talk further about some issues Dr. Moon raised after we listen to the comments of our next panelists. Now, I would like to hear some thoughts from our next discussant, Mr. Takon Lee. Mr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be speaking in Korean from now on. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Thank you so much for your presentation. The moderator at the beginning of this session said that environmental disaster or climate disaster cause devastating consequences. As they suggest, climate change, I feel that, is devastating. So that's why we are all invited to this session. This is universal damage, and especially it is discriminate as the damage are concentrated in the most vulnerable group, as said by the two presenters. Especially two presenters said that climate change or climate events itself does not end, but it is also related to the peace and human rights. So that kind of nexus has been explained in the two presentations. I fully agree with it. So instead of giving a comment to the presenter, please allow me to explain what UNHCR has been done in this aspect. But before that, as I was listening to Dr. Huang, actually I have one question. Human Rights Committee made a general comment, or sometimes some other systems produced a comment on the human rights and violation of human rights induced by climate change. As far as I know, in 2001 or 2020, HRC made very first decision on the petition on the climate change induced the victimization. So repatriation was a violation of a human right, the decision said. So can you explain about this decision? Or do you think that the same decision has been repeated or will be repeated? And do you think that that decision will influence the future decisions of the HRC? So if you can answer to my question, that would be very useful. So this has been already covered. The climate change does not itself lead to violence, but there is an interaction because institutional and socio-economic fragility exaggerate the conflict and violence which already exist. So the most vulnerable groups should be protected by the global community. That's why the UNHCR need to give the tools for protection for these vulnerable groups. Climate change caused the refugee movement. In 2018, the Refugee Global Compact also revealed that actually it was adopted by many countries including Korea, and it says that the climate change can cause refugee movement and forced dislocation can be also caused by the natural disaster, it says. Also, this kind of forced dislocation need to be protected. In order to remove the vacuum of the protection, the international community has several mandates. I didn't specify it, but the dislocation global compact also talks about the nexus between natural disaster and dislocation. UNHCR also has a role in addressing climate change and disaster-related displacement. According to the mandate, it provides legal advice, guidance, and support to the international community by considering the climate change and environmental consideration, and also we provide the relevant recommendation to each member state following its mandates to take the climate changes into consideration. UNHCR provides support or durable solution. I mean, there are three solutions. First is the voluntary return to the homeland, or the settlement in the third country, or the integration into a new society. These three tools are used as a durable solution, but it can be blocked by the climate change. For example, because of the climate change, settlement or return might be disturbed, or because of climate change, social or economic situation of a specific society can be undermined, which makes the refugees harder and harder to live in a specific society. UNHCR in 2020 produced a guidance that tells that what kind of international law should be considered in providing assistance. The details is as you can see on the slide. Climate refugee. This term has been used in official manner because the climate change definition is still not clear, and there are 5 specific groups of climate refugees, including ethnic, political opinion, or social groups. So there are 5 major categories that causes discrimination, and if that definition met, they can be said as climate refugees. So refugees cannot be actually induced by the climate change according to the definition of the Refugee Convention. However, as other speakers said, climate change and environmental change can be a disaster to human rights of a certain person, so it can be said as a climate change in an unofficial manner, and because of the consequences of the climate change, sometimes they can be regarded as a refugee indirectly. Climate change is not discriminate. It affects the entire society or a nation as a whole. So from the perspective, the UN Refugee Convention says that in the past, actually, they provide a guidance on the protection of the victims of the internal warfare. If some population is affected by a certain event, it is still very difficult to say that the effect of an individual can be smaller or larger than an effect on the population. That should not be justified or validated by the individual. Instead, that kind of evidence should be submitted at the individual level, and that can be justified in the persecution. The persecution of an individual and the persecution of the society can be indirectly evidenced by the persecution of a certain individual. Also, that can be applied to the social or economic affairs as well. Especially those who are vulnerable groups who are mostly affected by the climate change, as said by the two speakers. For the protection, I'm going to talk about the alternative settlement. Those who apply for the alternative settlement should be protected, but the question here is that whether that individual really need to go to a third country to avoid the persecution. If that is the case, that country, the host country, does not need to protect any additional protection. That is the definition of alternative settlement. But UN refugees strongly said that the interpretation of it should be very specific. The legal basis of this settlement, alternative settlement, and the possibility of being exposed to another persecution in the third place should be interpreted before making a decision. Especially the victim of a certain persecution can also see the effect of a certain event to the entire population, said the UNHCR. And I'm going to talk about as you can see on the bottom, the high-level protection of the human rights. As it was said by the presenters, the HCR or the Torture Prevention Convention should be referred when deciding whether a certain people has been victimized of the violation of a human rights. And for this kind of people, that kind of protection also should be provided, and it is called the complementary forms of international protection. Climate change or natural disaster-induced forced dislocation sometimes can be subject to the complementary forms of international protection. If they cannot be subject to the complementary forms, by considering the humanitarian assistance, sometimes they can provide temporary protection. Some developed countries even provided that kind of temporary protection for those who have been victimized by the climate event or climate change. If you can give just one more minute, let me talk about the Korean issues as well and wrap up my presentation. Korea is also providing a sort of complementary forms of international protection. As I said in the second article of the HCR law, they are allowed to stay within Korea for some time. And it is almost same to the Torture Prevention Convention. If they are violated and physically and mentally, and if there is a clear evidence for the violation or persecution, they are allowed to temporarily stay in Korea. And the Korean government in the past actually allowed that kind of temporary stay, and they consider it as a part of the temporary protection of the human rights. But in practice, that kind of temporary stay should be also extended to those who have been victimized by the torture. But in addition, those who applied for the refugee status sometimes fail to get a refugee status, but they are still allowed to stay within a country for the sake of the human right protection. Thus, the kind of temporary human rights stay should not be done at the individual level. Even if they don't have the refugee status, they are allowed to stay in a certain country for a specific period of time. Sometimes they are not even allowed to stay within a state country. If they fail to apply for the refugee status, for example, those who run away from the internal conflicts might be subjected to the persecution, so they should be protected with the temporary protection or complementary forms. Those who have been forced to dislocate because of the natural disaster should be also fall into the category or the scope of the temporary protection so that they can stay within a specific country for a certain period of time. The remaining is about the summary of the UNHCR recommendations. So If you want to know about the details of it, please refer to this list of the references if you want to know more details, and I'll ask any question if you have any later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, for sharing some insight from the perspective of vulnerable people, highly and easily exposed to climate risk. As shared by Mr. Lee, humanitarian challenges are the frequently mentioned issues that we need to look into, obviously. To set the tone for further discussion of some key issues or questions, I would like to give the floor to the panelists. Let me first give our two presenters quick time to respond to the questions raised by Dr. Moon and then Mr. Lee. Dr. Huang, will you go first?
Yes, happy to. So I'll just switch to English. So thank you so much for all the great discussions and the questions. I hope I actually got the questions right. So I have two questions about how to break this trajectory of supporting coal industries and oil and gas. So one thing I think we can do is that what we are doing is really focusing on the goals, short-term goals or the long-term goals, and also to emphasize that this is just not a sustainable solution anymore. Like we're going to face it very soon. We're facing it already. So this is not a sustainable way of producing energy and consuming energy. So that's one thing I can say. And also, let's turn into the technology advancement, because the renewable energy, like compared to 10 years ago and now, is extremely, the prices of renewable energy has gone a lot cheaper. So it makes a lot of sense for sustainable development to move to cleaner energy and the renewable energy. And it also makes a lot of economic sense in that way. And second is how to break this. So we have seen a lot of some in the law division of the UNEP, and we see a lot of legal cases, citizens and the activists and people actually challenging the government and also challenging the businesses about subsidizing and also like not meeting the climate goals or not having the enough sufficient climate ambitions. And that is compelling courts to actually order the governments or businesses actually to do better and to address climate change. And second, I'm going to go very quickly because I'm conscious of the time. So second, UNEP's position on the environmental issues. I hope I got that right. And one is UNEP has a position of addressing environmental issues with the view to actually look at it as a triple environmental planetary crisis. So climate change and biological loss of biodiversity and the nature loss, and also the pollution. So those three huge issues are interlinked. So climate change cannot be just solved by addressing climate change, but it's also we need to think about conservation and the protection of biological diversity, as well as pollution, such as air pollution is linked to climate change. So we are trying to take this, we're taking this integrated approach to environmental issues that we call triple environmental crisis. So second is also another position that we have is promoting the living in harmony with nature. So we're taking this approach of the nature-based solutions to climate actions and also biodiversity actions and all other environmental actions. And third that I can mention that I would like to emphasize is partnership. So we work at the UN, and also I think I see that with a lot of governments as well. We work in silos. But this climate change and human rights issues and conflict, we cannot just work in silos. And everybody's working in their corners. That doesn't work anymore. So we're promoting the partnership and also breaking the silos to work together, because this is a global issue that countries will have to work together, and this is an issue that different ministries and different UN agencies will have to work together. And third question, thanks so much for the actually raising this. I forgot Probably should have mentioned it. So the Human Rights Committee decision. So my colleague from the UNHCR asked me to actually elaborate a little bit on the Human Rights Committee's decision. So that was 2020. So Human Rights Committee that oversees the monitors and it received the complaints about the rights violations related to the civil and political rights, including the right to life. They ruled this very historic and groundbreaking actually decision that there's one man from Kiribati, which is sinking, and a small island is sinking, and he was living in New Zealand, and he claimed that his right to life is going to be violated if he's sent back to his own country, Kiribati. So at that time, actually, the committee members decided that his right has not been violated yet. So it didn't actually stop him from actually being sent back to his own country, but it actually opened up a lot of doors to like climate asylum seekers and the people to actually claim their right. How climate change is going to affect their rights and how the governments will have to take an action on it. So what they have done is the committee members say that it hasn't been violated, but if this claim came a few years later, we'll rule this is a violation of his right to life. So since then, as I mentioned, there was a groundbreaking decision of the Human Rights Committee. And since then, there are a lot more cases filed to the committee, such as there's Australian Indigenous community called Indigenous peoples called Torres Islanders. They filed also a complaint to the Human Rights Committee about their right to life and also other rights related to their livelihoods and so on. Because due to climate change. So that decision is still pending, and that we're expecting that actually will come out sometime this year. But you see that the increasing cases going to the human rights mechanisms and human rights treaty bodies in claiming that rights are violated because of climate change. And it's not only limited to the Human Rights Committee and the CRC, the Committee on the Rights of the Child. They're also developing a general comment on climate change and environment. So they're trying to also they are working on a draft to see how climate change is affecting children's rights and children's rights, various rights that they're entitled to. And they're also making recommendations what states will have to do in this regard. So it's happening across all the human rights mechanisms and systems. And as I mentioned in the towards the end of my presentation, so the UN recognition of the right to a healthy environment, recognizing living in a healthy environment as a human right, that's going to have a lot more influence in the people to exercise their right and relating to climate change and other environmental issues. So I'll stop here and I'll pass it over back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hang. Now, Dr. Kramp, will you respond next?
Yep. Yeah, thank you so much. Really interesting. And I wanted to pick up 2 points that Dr. Moon made. You're absolutely right with the let's say fallback because of the Ukraine war that we're seeing, especially in Europe, a fallback to coal power, etc. I think it's difficult to talk about opportunity in the context of war, but it is an absolutely missed opportunity. I hope it is something that is done in the short run, but now is the time to invest in a transition, because we see, and the Ukrainian war or the Russian invasion in Ukraine shows that so clearly, how the dependency on fossil fuels is a serious security issue and inhibiting us in fostering peace. So I really hope that it will enable a push towards renewable energy, and I think we see signs of that. We see signs of that in the US, which I think Biden had linked the military sort of a defense planning towards renewable energy. I think that is absolutely crucial, and we need much more investment in that. On the mapping of climate change and conflict, I think there are quite a few efforts out there that are trying to map climate change and conflict, and we do some of them as well. What I have a difficulty with is that let me simplify it, right? It gives us a red dot on a map. It does not tell us what's going on in that red dot. There are very few mappings that I have come across that are really good. USAID did one in 2018 that was really good. It was really methodologically well done. Unfortunately, it hasn't been updated since then. But it's also, there's a difficulty in two terms. What is the input variables that we choose? We can, if we take two of the most established indexes, one is the ND Gain index from Notre Dame. If we take climate vulnerability as an indicator there and how they assess it, we focus on Africa. If we take I forgot the name now of the other index, other variables like natural disasters are much more emphasized in this index. So we all of a sudden focus much more on Asia, right? Because of different climate indexes or climate differences where we put most weight on the impact. But I think that either way will distort the picture, because obviously these impacts are complex. They are different in different regions, in different contexts, which is our biggest challenge that we're going to have, because there is we understand this relationship now, but there is no determinism in it. We cannot say there's a drought coming in Somalia that will turn out in X, Y, Z in terms of conflict. That is simply not the case. The same climate variables have different outputs in terms of insecurity. In Africa, if we generalize, in the Horn of Africa, we see specifically communal or community-based violence. As a consequence, if we take South Asia, we see specifically protests and rioting as an outcome. The problem is there's not a given in that, right? And I think that is, on the other hand, really important and a good thing, because it shows us that we can intervene, that we have a space of human action. It is decisions that are being made about peace and conflict. And I think that is something important to remember, because then we can find those spaces of action to prevent violence and sustain peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kramp, for your answer and comment. Now, due to the time constraint, I would like to open the floor for the audience. Due to time constraint, I'll take only one or two questions. Please understand this situation. When given a chance to ask a question or share any thought, please introduce yourself briefly and specify to whom your question is directed, and share your question with us. Is there any question from the floor? Please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Josue Lopez. I'm a student from Seoul National University. This question is addressed to Director Kramp. First of all, I agree with the integrated approach, which is human rights, peace, and security. I think is really important for governments, for public institutions, NGOs, private institutions to have this knowledge of integrated approach. Something that Director Kramp mentioned was to prepare effective solutions through activities to our institutions so that they can tackle this integrated approach. I'm from Ecuador, so back in Ecuador, what we have is government institutions, but we have rotation from our technical parts, from our leaderships, ministers, secretaries, etc. how can we have a more effective solution regarding this rotation of personnel in public institutions? So I would like to see if there's an effective solution or an ideal solution regarding this. Thank you so much.
To save time, I just want to take just one more question. Please.
Hello, my name is Ravi Pandit. I am from India. My question is, I think it's pretty simple, but quite perplexing at the same time. I see about the solutions that's being presented, and maybe this might sound maybe quite ironic, but the reason why we are having these conferences and these forums are because of systematic governance failures. And then the solutions that are, I wouldn't say presented, but the solutions that are maybe recommended are also related to governance. So somewhere I feel that there's an absence of public opinion within those solutions, or the involvement of public. And also, Jeffrey Sachs made this statement, I remember, for UNICEF, I believe, where he mentioned that around $5,000 is required for each person or annually as an income for someone to become environmentally sensitive. And then at the same time, there's a book that came out, I think in 2012 by Bjorn Lomborg. And he also mentioned, he ranked basically the number of problems based on the amount of money required to solve. And education was also at the top. So somewhere I feel like, rather than, is it possible to give us a less diplomatic answer and actually saying is that what is needed by the people to solve, or how can I, just being an individual, how can I solve this issue, or how can I contribute? Thank you so much.
Now, I will give the floor to first Dr. Kramp to answer.
Okay, thank you so much. I think it's an interesting question about the rotation in ministries. I wonder if I'm not an expert on that, obviously. I haven't worked in a ministry, but I see that on the one hand, it's an opportunity because you learn about different issues. So we mainstream the issue across different fields. And if you worked on climate security once, you probably will take that over into your next, but maybe there's some experiences also from UNEP, because there's also, of course, some rotation and experiences mainstreaming. On the other hand, of course, it's I mean, yeah, great. If you work for 20 years on the same topics, then you generate a certain expertise. But maybe it's also refreshing to have some new ideas in there. I think there's probably an interaction of the policy and research world that is really important, and we have very good experiences here in Sweden with our colleagues in the foreign ministry, where there is an established relationship. So even if somebody is new and there is a rotation, there is a continuation of expertise. I think the other question on individual responsibility, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a certain hubris in it, and we need to revamp the governance system, right? I mean, there needs to be governance solutions, and we need to start rethinking that we can't act the same way. On a pessimistic note, I don't know if individually we can solve it, because sure, you can do things and reduce your environmental footprint, but in the end of the day, it is states and the massive emissions from industries that need to change. That is where we need to focus on. That is absolutely critical.
Thank you. Can I expect other response from the other panelists? Another response from panelists or our discussant?
Okay. I would like to talk about one of the questions from Seoul, SNU. I think to handle these issues in proper way, we need a global governance much better than current systems. That was my main point to raise to Dr. Hwang. What about the position of UNEP over other UN agencies? For my view, and by looking at Ukraine crisis, Ukraine war by Russia, and by looking at some other issues, my main area is development corporations, foreign aid, etc. That is my main experts. Well, even my sector, international corporations, yes, global governance. Where is the global governance? Do we have a desirable or systemic, efficient global governance we have? I'm not sure about that issues. Environmental issues is very critical and essential. We cannot ignore anymore. However, in my perspective, in terms of global governance, we have very loose governance at the global level of governance. So we need to reform that governance or establish the global architecture or global governance to handle these issues in proper way. That is my view on your questions. What we need? Yes, we need more better global governance to handle these issues. But at the moment, I'm not sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, the time given for this session has come to an end, so I need to wrap up. It was indeed such an insightful panel discussion that you can reflect more on current issues about where the policy and governance for enhancing climate security should be headed. I hope today's session has been a timely momentum to encourage more in-depth discussions on climate change and conflict and find the best way to promoting a sustainable peace. I thank you all panelists and audience who have joined both virtually and in person for today's session. I also thank Jeju Forum organizers for giving us this excellent opportunity to have an in-depth understanding on climate change and conflict relationships and ways toward sustainable peace. I hope everyone to have a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening for the rest of the day. Thank you.